Welcome to the Explorer Poet Podcast, an exploration of the blurry line separating our physical world from our abstract realities. Conversations and stories, myths and reality, science and the gods we worship, the esoteric and the everyday. Come explore with me. Okay. Hi, Brad. Welcome to the Explorer Poet Podcast.
Hi, Josh. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I came across your writing in the MythBuster series for the Joseph Campbell Foundation. But in looking into that, before I reached out to you, I realized that you actually do a lot of different things. So I think this conversation could go all over the place with the different things that you're involved in and the work that you do. But where I usually like to start with people is at the very beginning. You know, what drew you to the world of myth? What drew you to the type of work that you're involved with with the Joseph Campbell Foundation? You know, what's your background? And you know, from a childhood through early adulthood, like what was it that kind of led up to this interest in myth and wanting to kind of gear your life towards the study of it and helping others, you know, apply myth in their lives? You know, what was that impetus?
Largely that comes from reading. Literature and just reading generally was really important to me when I was younger. It kind of, I think there were some authors who sort of saved me when I was an adolescent and going through some difficulties. And so I started reading Russian novelists like Dostoevsky and Chekhov's plays and things like that, Turgenev. So these kinds of things sort of, you know, one book opens another one. And I just kept reading some of these modernist writers and really fell in love with that whole thing. And I have a really checkered background. I don't know quite how to put this all in context, but when I was, I'd gone away to school and wasn't really being grabbed by being a student and being in the academy. And my version of running away to the circus was I ran away and joined the police department. And so I was a cop for about 6 years. And then I was, I think, pretty unhappy ultimately and looking for ways out. So I went back to what I knew worked and started reading more and more and eventually decided I should go back to school. And so I went back to school and I decided I would major in biology. A friend of mine told me that he would give me his chiropractic practice if I had gone back to school and then gone to chiropractic college. And that was very appealing to me. Ultimately, I got to organic chemistry, and that was the end of that science track for me. So I would talk to my advisor, and I said, well, I don't really know what to do. And he said, well, what do you like to do? I said, well, I like to read. And so he said, well, major in literature. So I changed my major to literature. I was concerned I couldn't find work, you know, with a literature degree. And so I added a psychology major to it. Nobody told me that I really couldn't find work with a psychology degree either at the bachelor's level. So I ended up back in the criminal justice system, and I worked for Superior Court doing investigations and things like that. And then after about 3 years of that, I went back to graduate school in psychology and was in a very operant program, you know, very, very Skinnerian, and found that didn't really do much for me. I mean, I liked the idea of you know, the behavioral reinforcements and things like that. But ultimately, it wasn't what I was looking for. And I ended up in a doctoral program at the University of Oklahoma where I was studying with a Freudian, and I decided I'd do some Freudian analysis of my own. So I got really immersed in Freud, and then it was really enjoyable, really intellectual. Didn't give me what I was looking for therapeutically. That happened later when I moved back to the Valley, and ended up seeing a Jungian analyst. That was also really interesting, intellectually stimulating, but it seemed more more in sync with what I was needing and what I was looking for at the time. And so I studied more and more of Jung. I was working for a time for Catholic Social Services as a therapist. That was sort of a time of initiation in some ways. It was almost like a MASH unit for psychologists. You know, you get everything and every degree of pathology that you can imagine that would come through the doors there. Then I went into private practice in Scottsdale, and from there we moved up to Flagstaff, and I was working in private practice in Flagstaff. And I had, a few years earlier, had seen The Power of Myth, that series that Joseph Campbell did with Bill Moyers. And that was kind of a revelation for me. It really showed, again, the power of literature. And I come to myth through literature, really, primarily. I think as Campbell did too. Campbell's graduate degrees at Columbia were in literature. And so the way that narrative and story can be therapeutic. And I started incorporating some of this into my practice. And then somewhere along the way, I learned about Pacifica Graduate Institute, which is a institute that awards degrees in myth and depth psychology and things like that. So I thought that would be a good thing to do. And so I started the PhD program in mythology there and finished that up, and kind of went back to my practice. But I went back to my practice with this deeper grounding in story and myth and literature and in depth psychology, which includes both Freudian and Jungian orientations, and just began writing. And I had blogs were just starting to be big at that time, and I had a blog called Falstaff Was My Tutor, because I think Shakespeare is probably one of the greatest psychologists who's ever lived. And that became rather popular for a period of time. And after a while, I decided I think I needed to just kind of collect those essays and maybe rewrite them and publish them in a collected book. So that, oddly enough, I'm still working on. But in the meantime, I've written a few other things. And as you say, I wrote regularly for the MythBlast series and at the Joseph Campbell Foundation, which are really just short essays that incorporate myth and Campbell, obviously, and popular culture, psychology, philosophy, and so forth. And these essays are really nice ways to enter this world of myth. We have a really diverse bunch of authors, and I think that it, as I say, is a nice entree into the world of myth, or the world of Campbell, at least. I'm also the director of publications for the Campbell Foundation, and I host my own podcast called Pathways with Joseph Campbell. And this is a podcast where we take all this archived audio. We've got so much archived audio of Campbell lecturing and speaking at various places throughout the course of his career. Some of this stuff existed on old wire recordings that we transferred to audio tape and and then we transferred that audio tape to a digital medium. And so we've got a remarkable storehouse of Campbell lecturing. And then I essentially, in the podcast, I essentially introduce the lecture that we listen to, and I talk to a little bit about it, set the stage for it, where it was done and what year it was done and things like that. And then after he's done speaking, I'll come back and give some commentary on some of the really interesting points, at least to me, of the lecture. And so that's been very successful, and it's been very gratifying to do that. And we're continuing to grow and expand our reach at the foundation. And it's one of the really nice ways I get to spend my time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Joseph Campbell, for me, I had like a similar experience when I came across his work, where I was also a reader growing up. I read a lot, especially, I mean, to me, turning out like my whole life, I wanted to be a writer. And I think it's because of when I was a kid, just reading and just the way that I felt like I had been to so many different places just because I would sit down and consume a book. And I got to see so many different things and experience so many different things. And it really was, as a kid even, it seemed, looking back on it now, it was like something magical in a way. And so but I had grown up in a literal religion my whole life, being the LDS Church or the Mormon Church. And so I really enjoyed stories, like good stories, but I never really saw the mythical side of it. I didn't understand the psychology of it. But it wasn't until my adult life that I came across Joseph Campbell. And I think most people are very familiar with him because of his hero of 1,000 Faces, which is a great book, and it kind of explains what's called the monomyth. But that interview series that you talk about, or that you mentioned, The Power of Myth, I picked that up as a book. Somebody had converted it into a book, and it just reads like their manuscript of their conversation.
Right.
But it really changed the way that I thought about myth. And so then I went and read The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And then for me, what really did it for me was reading Joseph Campbell's series, The Masks of God. And I don't know a lot of people who have gotten all the way through it, but have you read the full 4-part series?
I have indeed. Yeah.
It's,
I was given the opportunity when I really was getting more and more involved. The president of the foundation at the time, he said, I'll give you whatever you need. Just read all the collected works that we have, and then when you're done, we'll figure out what to do with you. And so it was really a nice way to sort of be immersed in Campbell for a while, because I knew about Campbell. Like I said, seen and listened to The Power of Myth, but I wasn't really a big Campbell fan until I really started digging into him and reading his work. And that Masks of God series that you mentioned is really a remarkable piece of work. It's 4 volumes, and it covers prehistoric. It's called Primitive Mythology by Campbell. We don't necessarily use that word much anymore, but it covers that whole Paleolithic, Neolithic, early human history kind of stuff. And then he goes into Asian mythology, Occidental mythology, and then the last volume is creative mythology. And that's a really popular volume among a lot of my friends who are artists and creators of various kinds. And it's a marvelous piece of work.
Yeah, it really changed the way that I saw myth, or even it helped me really understand that we as humans, we have this psychology, and part of our psychology is that we must tell stories. It's how we interpret things. It's how we understand things. And that series, just the way that he was able to go from those different pieces, from the primitive or the ancient, the archaic myth, and how people use that myth to understand their existence, up through he does the Eastern and the Occidental, and then that creative mythology one where it brings it all together in a way where you can see the myth that we're living today, the various myths that we're living, where did they come from and how did we get them? And I came to really see my own mind as something different than I thought it was, because I realized that I think the things that I think, or I'm capable of thinking the things that I think, because other people had thought things before me. And it's almost like the myth or the stories that we live, they've just been gradually evolving over time. And we're just at some point in that evolution. And it was fascinating to me. And I also find it fascinating that a lot of people who gravitate towards Joseph Campbell also gravitate towards Carl Jung and Jungian analysis. It makes sense, but because there's so much overlap with the myth and the symbol, the stories and the characters and the archetypes. But in reading, I guess in reading Joseph Campbell's The Masks of God, I came to see that this is an evolving myth, and it's going to evolve again, or it's going to continue evolving. And then in reading Carl Jung, particularly his Red Book, and I don't know if you've read the Red Book, but
yeah, I have that enormous copy that was first
really
published. Yeah. It's
okay.
a remarkable piece of work. It's almost like Jung just kind of opens up his mind and lets you kind of swim around in his unconscious for a while in that book. It's quite remarkable.
Yeah, it really, when I read it, I've got a nice copy that's like got a kind of a leathery cover, and the way that they printed it with the different colors on the text or the font, it's very interesting. And when I read it, it was the closest thing I think I've ever seen to the exploration of the new myth, or like what's coming ahead. And it's the kind of thing that I don't get a chance to talk to a lot with just people in my regular life, because they're so they're just not into they don't go studying it, so they don't see where they're at now as something that came, like, evolved from before, but they also don't think about where we are now. It's going to evolve going forward as well, and it's going to change. So that's something that's really interesting to me. And I think that's why the myth connects, like this idea of myth connects with me so much. I was thinking about it just a couple of weeks ago, and I was asking myself, what am I infinitely curious about? And one of those things is the evolution of the myth, and where's it going to go next, and where's it going to take us?
Yeah, I think that's something that most everybody who's interested in myth wonders about. What's the new mythology? But before I go down that road, I wanted to say I'm really accustomed to that feeling you get when you get excited about myth and are talking about myth, and you see a lot of glassy eyes looking back at you and wondering,
Yeah. I have a good friend and neighbor who comes over sometimes, and we do like camp, like a fire in my backyard, and just kind of stand around over the fire and have a talk. And he's a Christian, and he's a literal Christian. And I've gone on this big circle where I started off a literal Christian, and then I fell away from my faith. But then I found Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung and, a bunch of other people, Karen Armstrong and Mircea Eliade, and just all these different amazing thinkers and writers and explorers. And now I've come full circle to realize that I might not be a literal Christian anymore, but I'm still definitely a Christian in the tradition, or in kind of the cultural sense, but also in a psychological sense. And so to have a conversation with him about the difference between reading the Christian myth literally versus reading it psychologically or mystically, the kind of the way that Joseph Campbell talks about often, the different ways to read myths. When you get that blank look or that glossy-eyed look, because people have never even considered it in such a fashion to where if I start talking about it, it's the first time they've ever encountered it. And they almost don't even know where to go with it.
Yeah, we tend to talk about things like this with substantive language, right? That there's these ideas that we're speaking about in that way become nouns, right? That's the substantive use of language. And of course, from that kind of frequent customary use of language, people assume that every substantive idea or expression has an actual substantial something behind it. And as a result of that kind of overdetermined presumption, a poetic notion, a poetic idea is degraded into kind of a prosaic pronouncement. And of course, then we have no choice but to understand God as an actual being or thing instead of a metaphor for some ineffable truth. God loses its metaphorical nature and then is subsequently related to and relied upon as though it were an actual, entity. And so the beauty of Campbell is that he says, well, you don't have to let go of your religion. You just kind of have to open up a little bit, and you can use the symbols of your religion and understand what they mean to you psychologically. And this is, to me, one of the really brilliant moves that Campbell has made, to be able to take these, like familiar ideas that we learn in church or at the temple or wherever, we hear them, and be able to sort of retain the symbolic value of the image. And then how are we in relation to that symbol? How does that symbol work on us? And to me, this is one of the most, I think, valuable things that Campbell contributed.
Oh yeah, that was definitely part of reading his series, that aspect of it, and learning that there are multiple ways to look at myth, multiple ways to read it. And so you don't have to treat something as if it's true or untrue just because you can't get past the idea of literal or substantive or non-existent. It's more, once you can see the story as a thing that's taking place inside of you. And it does require a certain level or a certain amount of vocabulary. And I think that's partly why I also gravitate towards Jung, because Jung really gives you the vocabulary of the psyche, where you have these different pieces, these different aspects. You have your conscious and your unconscious, and you have your true self and your shadow and your anima. And you start developing this idea of like, oh, there are these archetypes inside of me. And I think that they're probably genetically coded into all of us. I often think about Rumi's quote, which I recently just wrote a little Substack on. But Rumi, he had this quote where he said, "You're not a drop in the ocean, but you're the entire ocean in a drop." And in a way, I think about it as we all contain the potentiality for any of the archetypes to arise within us. Given the right circumstances, given the right necessity, given the right courage, we can all call upon almost any aspect of humanity. And we have these various sides. And so pairing Jung's model for the human psyche and what's contained inside of it, the symbols that bubble up from the unconscious, pairing that with Joseph Campbell's idea of stories, his demonstration of the evolution of the story, and then just realizing that that's all happening inside of us. It's very powerful. In fact, it's made, I think for me, I don't know if this works for everybody, but for me, I felt like a depressed, lost person for a very long time. And I tried traditional therapy, and I tried very hard to just be happy and take care of myself in a way that I thought would be beneficial. But once I started to see these things, it was almost as if I realized that, oh, I can just do this on my own. I can just explore myself. And especially once you accept that you do have a shadow, once you accept that you don't have to be a perfect person and you don't have to always be happy, and you can start differentiating between what's truly beneficial for you and what's holding you back based on some story that you've believed. It feels as if once you really grasp it, you can go down a path of self-improvement and self-discovery that is, for me, it was vastly more helpful and more engaging than, talk therapy or behavioral therapy. Yeah, because you can just engage, and I think you probably understand this pretty well. You can just engage with the myth, and every time you see a story, you watch a movie, you read a book, you can sit there and go, "Oh, yeah, I've seen those characters in myself.
Yeah.
Like I've seen myself do that." And once you see the characters doing it in another story, you can see how it turns out depending on the decisions that they make. You can start to, pivot little things in your own life, change the story that's operating in your own head.
Yeah, that idea that you just articulated is so important. We can change the story. We, sometimes it seems to me as if, and by the way, that's a phrase that Jung uses probably more than any other. It is as if, but it's as if we're constituted by story. That without story, we just cease to be. It's almost as though Jesus is quoted in John saying that in the beginning was the word logos, right? In the Greek word logos, it means word, but it also means story or narrative. And so in the beginning is the word, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us. I think that in some ways it's almost literally true. It's not the word of God, but it's the story that we tell ourselves about who we are, about what we are. And that isn't this kind of adamantine thing. I mean, it's quite malleable. We tell ourselves different stories at different times. And, this is the problem with, we're always looking for truth, but, the only truth we can really apprehend is the kind of the small t truth. The capital T truth is sort of beyond our ability to grasp as human beings. You mentioned archetypes in biology, and I think you're right. I think Campbell believed myth was rooted in biology. Jung believed that the psyche held the archetypes, and of course, the psyche is part of our biology, right? It's part of the mind, whatever that is. And again, there's a word we have to use pretty loosely, I think, but so there is this biological connection, and so you have this very kind of personalized kind of subjective sense of symbols and story and things like that. That's very hard to get out of, to get away from. This is all going to be understood subjectively, and there's nothing really wrong with that as long as we realize that. Because, every myth is a myth for some group of people, a particular group of people at a particular time in history and in a particular geographic location. And so we have to understand that when we use the myth. And this is the disadvantage of, literalizing the myth, because if you literalize a myth that, say, comes out of a Middle Eastern a Bronze Age period, it won't help you understand the world very well, because the science is going to be a Bronze Age science, right? And so this is where, taking those images and seeing how they work on me today in the present, in the 21st century, is an incredibly important move to make with myth. That's the way it becomes, it can be still a living myth that way. And of course, to the question of the new myth, I don't want to leave that hanging out there. That's a question that I get asked constantly. And my answer is always, I don't know what it's going to be. It takes a very, very, very long time to make a myth. And myth is usually a myth for a relatively small group of people. The way that we are able to interact, we have this kind of global community now. it's very hard to get 8 billion people on the same page. And so some unifying global myth, I don't know. I'm doubtful that can happen. But whatever the myth is going to be, it has to be able to address that kind of global community that we're a part of. And so, for Campbell, the new myth was certainly going to have something to do with that. And he was particularly influenced by the moon landing and that photo from the moon of Earth called Earthrise that, all of us have seen. He was just, he was so blown away by that. And he said, this is part of what the new myth will be, the ability to see the world without division, without boundary, that sort of thing. And I think he's right about that. Now, how that's going to look, I have no idea. Will it have elements of the old myths? I don't know. It may have.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. That idea of myths being for a certain group of people, because it's not as if there's a myth that has taken over the entire world even today. Like, we haven't seen it.
Right.
There's always been pockets, and then there's always branches as well. Even in the Christian world, the first established Christian, there were Christians, but when the Romans established Christianity as the religion of their empire, and then it became the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church then split between the Romans and the Eastern Orthodox. And then in the West, we saw the Romans split, or the Catholic Church then split into the Lutherans and then the Protestants. And then in America, we've seen this huge explosion of all sorts of religions, which, that's what I grew up in, is an American Christian movement. And so now there's kind of an overarching myth of Jesus Christ and the God of the Old Testament as his father, or as his pair, I guess. But even then, it's all different myths scattered all over the place, and everybody kind of goes about it in living it in different ways. So it seems that the idea of a myth that would bring the entire world together, it seems so utopian. It seems almost so almost like a science fiction, because in a sense, so in one way, myths, they move around, they kind of absorb each other, they conquer each other. And in a sense, for the entire earth to be conquered by the same myth, it almost seems like there would need to be one ruling power, or otherwise there would need to be an outside force that threatens the entire earth, such that the earth, we all need to kind of stop squabbling over our own problems, and we kind of all need to get on the same page and work together to preserve our lives in juxtaposition to whatever's out there threatening it. So yeah, I think for the dreamers and the hopeful, I think it is like a beautiful idea that the earth could come under some new forward-thinking scientific, like, or at least have some basis in science, some kind of a myth that way. It seems more likely to me that the Christian myth evolves. I do have thoughts on this. I'm kind of curious I'm curious if you have more thoughts about, if we were to just say we were going to talk about the American Christian myth and where that might be headed. I'm curious if you have thoughts related to that.
Well, it seems to be headed farther and farther away from Christ and those teachings. So I'm not sure where this is going to be headed. There does seem to be a kind of element to this. Let's talk about Christian nationalists, I guess, and believe it to that group for the time being, because I think that's the most vocal of the groups right now. And they have this very kind of muscular Christianity that they seem to endorse, and the idea of compassion and love seems not to have made it into the thinking that is currently dominating that movement, which is an interesting thing to me, because that's essentially, in the early Christian cult that existed, in and around certain places, Rome, certain places in Greek and Eastern Turkey. This was a central idea, this idea of compassion and love and all of that. But this is, again, this is one of the problems with a kind of literalization of the myth. Then you begin to have people who say, I know what God wants. I am directly in touch with God. Well, in Western tradition, that's generally not the way it works. There's usually, let me back up. That often is the way it works. There's usually a mediator, right? Whether it's a priest or a minister or what have you. There's somebody that's between you and God. Now, in Asia, philosophically, religiously speaking, there is no mediator. The idea is that your challenge is to realize that, in fact, you're what you're looking for, that all the gods are in you, that all the heavens and the hells and all of that are within. And that's almost a direct quote of Campbell. And again, these have to be understood symbolically rather than literally for that to have any meaning for us. When we talk about, you'd mentioned The Hero with a Thousand Faces, that book is still a tremendously popular book, and we sell a lot of copies of it every year. It's become the book to read if you're a screenwriter in Hollywood, because of the story structure, right? The heroic narrative, that heroic arc. It can become very complex. People like to add all kinds of things to it, but essentially it boils down to three things. The call away, the call away from your kind of comfortable domestic life, and you're called away into this initiatory experience where you encounter a world and beings that you never knew existed. And then after a time where you kind of start to learn the physics of this strange new world, you return home. And you return with some kind of boon, usually, some kind of gift for your community. It could be literal, I suppose, in terms of wealth, bringing home some kind of treasure. But generally speaking, it's an idea. It's a model for living or something like that. And this is it's a powerful, powerful thing. And so this model really works well when you apply it to one's own psychology. That the real heroic journey is to understand the self. And in doing that, we're drawn away from this comfortable ego-based idea of the self that we have, where all of a sudden now, we have to deal with the shadow. And usually that shadow, by the way, is the first thing that happens in analysis, is that you have to deal with the shadow. This is the thing that usually arises first. And it's, Jung described the shadow one time in a very kind of vernacular way. He said the shadow is that thing no one wishes to be. So it's all those things that we find problematic about ourselves, all those things that are kind of atavistic and primal. The will to power, our greed, our desire to bend the world to our wishes, and other people. These are the first things we have to see and address in ourselves, because we all have that operating in some way. When we're unconscious of it, it's more powerful. The unconscious, the act of being unconscious feeds the shadow, and the shadow can grow. But what stands behind the shadow, when we start to look at it and we start to encounter it and understand it as a part of ourselves rather than something that's alien to us, we began to see that the shadow is hiding some extraordinary things, some extraordinary gifts, talents, capacities. Jung says that when the shadow begins to reveal some of these things, they have an increasingly numinous quality. And so doing the shadow work is a huge benefit to people in analysis, because there's this relief of seeing, first of all, that it's an archetypal experience. So I'm not the only one this way. And that's a huge relief in itself to know. But then to understand that you can, again, work with your own psychology, work with your own ego as a way of following this heroic path.
Yeah. I often think about in the modern world, in the Western Occidental American world that I live in, about, well, you talked about, for example, the Christian nationalists, and that one of the things that they seem to have moved away from is the idea of Christian empathy or Christ-like empathy. And so they're comfortable being kind of strong-handed. They're comfortable from a political perspective. They're comfortable with a big military and being having a strong military across the world. And so to me, that almost seems like part of our American shadow, is this idea that we have this duty or responsibility or like this godlike ability to go around and we proclaim freedom and liberty to everybody while forcing them to comply. And yeah, I think that shadow work, I often think about psychology as not just for the individual, but for the individual is just one aspect of a group. And the psychologically, all of these different models, they work on the individual, but they also work on every level all the way up to the entire species, meaning that we have this individual shadow, yes, and I think that you're right. The first step towards any kind of self-healing, improvement, maturation, individuation, whatever you want to call it, the first step is addressing the shadow. It seems that in order for us as a group, as a collective, to move forward into any kind of new myth, it's going to require addressing some shadow as well.
Yeah, I think that's true. And it's not that the shadow shouldn't be there. And by the way, when one goes through a Jungian analysis, one doesn't get rid of the shadow. It becomes integrated into consciousness, and in that way, its need for authority or control or whatever is diminished, because it's now kind of, you're able to see it consciously and go, oh, I understand what that is. That's not exactly how I want to be in the world. And then you can move. But everything has its own shadow. And one of the tenets of Jungian theory is that the tensions between the opposites are what make life possible. So you can't get rid of one or the other end of these pairs of opposites. Life would just fizzle out. Its tension is always the glue that things hang together with. And so what we have to do is learn how to deal with the tension of these opposites within ourselves. It's not that we become free from them. It's just that we get more familiar and comfortable dealing with ourselves as we are, rather than the ego that kind of wants us to be, something extraordinary. And I don't know. I mean, many of us are extraordinary, I suppose. I don't feel particularly extraordinary, but I think that when we start doing this work with our own shadow, there's a ripple effect that happens. We're different. We behave differently. We relate differently to our family and friends and people we run into. And that creates this ripple effect. And that ripple effect, like throwing a pebble into a pond, it reaches places that we would never anticipate it reaching. And so I think it's really important to be able to, recognize that.
Yeah, absolutely. The same way that, like in the medical industry, the first, I don't know, kind of code that they have, I can't remember what they call it, but they say first do no harm. And I think that's the first effect of shadow work, is you suddenly realize where you're doing some harm. And so you can just kind of like pull that back. And a lot of it may just be emotional projection, or just blaming others for the way that you feel. And so then you react in a way as if it's their fault. And you just kind of create these emotional tides that go out, or these emotional ripples. And if you can pull that back, that alone, if nothing else, if you stop doing harm in the world, I think that's the real benefit of everybody doing some real work on themselves, is that they just stop doing harm. But you also said that when you do shadow work, you get to a point where you can realize that there's actually good things in your shadow as well. There's actually an ability to do something more meaningful, but maybe you've been blocking yourself because of other aspects of your shadow, or fears that you might have, concerns about standing out in any way. Really, I think that's the hero, right? The ability to walk away from what's comfortable, go into the shadow, and go find that thing that is beneficial and bring it back. And there might be, like I said, that in America, we have this shadow that involves a large military and a lot of military actions. And it may very well be that if we could pull that back and trust the world to not rely on us, that there might be a lot of benefit. We might find that there could be a much more peaceful world without such a strong hand.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, even the shadow has a shadow. And so we can talk about, the shadow of the military, and what is the shadow of the military? Well, tremendous medical advances, for one thing, come about as a result of treating battlefield injuries. The way the advances we made in brain trauma, for instance, is partly due to the experience of battlefield doctors. So it's a very difficult question when we say we're not going to do any harm in the world, because I think it's almost impossible to not do harm, no matter how well-intentioned we are. I think that the best we can do is kind of lean towards the light, because there's always going to be consequences to every action that we can't anticipate. I was driving home one day, for instance, and it was rush hour. The traffic was heavy. Both lanes going south and north were filled with vehicles, and we had come to a stop in the roadway. And there was a person kind of, in the middle in that middle lane wanting to make a left turn in front of the traffic. And so the car in front of me was being kind of a conscientious driver, a very nice person, and decided to let that car make that left turn, but didn't anticipate the traffic in the right lane, that couldn't see what was happening. And so as that person made that left turn, the person driving in the right lane didn't see them. And of course there was this accident. And by being nice, this person caused an accident. Now this is the human dilemma. This is what we're faced with as human beings all the time in one way or another. And so we have to, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything, but we just have to be thoughtful and consider the environment that we're in and make the best stab at doing the right thing that we can do. As I say, it's unavoidable. The consequences will happen one way or another, and the best we can do is just kind of lean toward the light.
Yeah, you're probably right. I guess that alone, just accepting that, I don't know if you call it a paradox, just that the idea that by trying to do good, you can do harm. Like you just can't control it. Some part of that is accepting that is probably part of the process as well. I'm curious because the idea of, so we've said in this conversation that people or humans, we think in stories or we think through stories. And then from a Joseph Campbell perspective, myth is kind of this bigger story that we're all living. And usually myth is effective when you're unconscious that it's a story. You're kind of just going along with it because it's the reality that you've always known or the world that you grew up in that you were adapted to. I'm curious from your perspective, is there a myth that stands out to you today that we're all living that most people don't see? Or what is like a myth that we've evolved to, or that we've arrived at where most people don't realize it's a myth, but we're living it?
One of the things that occurs to me, it's a really good question, by the way. I'm not sure if I've ever been asked that exact question. But one of the things that occurs to me is our own lives are myths. And of course, we live as though we're this, material thing, and we live kind of as though we're immortal. I mean, we give some kind of intellectual acknowledgement to our mortality, but most of us live without the thought of dying. And we kind of are these mythic entities ourselves, which may be one of the reasons why we're so drawn to myth. I mean, to the myths of heroes and gods and all of that, and we are kind of the hero of our own story, and for good or for ill. And one person's hero is another person's tyrant, I suppose. But
for sure. Seems like it does seem like some people gravitate towards the idea that they're the hero of their story, and other people almost gravitate towards the idea that there's some other aspect even of their own story. Like some people, I think, view themselves as the victim of their story, or I don't know. It's hard because it's not like I can put myself in the heads of others, but the way that I observe certain people behave, or just as I encounter different people, I often wonder whether or not they can actually see themselves as the hero of their own story, or if they're just waiting for somebody else to come be the hero in their story. One thing that's interesting to me about the evolution of myth and how myth gets how it gets transferred to the people is the extreme popularity of superhero movies in our time. And I think there's an economic reason why the superhero movies took over around like the shifts in technology and what needs to be in the box offices and that. But when I watch, I can't really watch the superhero movies because I just don't find them that interesting. But the that I observe people who really, really love them, who really absorb them. And it's almost as if there is this myth that somebody's supposed to come along and save us all. And it really does seem like there are a lot of people who don't feel like the hero of their own story, and they're looking for some kind of mythical character to come and be the hero of all of us.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I have this idea that in my mind that's still kind of working on what you said here, but I think this idea of the superheroes coming to save us. This is not unlike the old Greek myths of heroes like Odysseus or Achilles or those kinds of folks. They're not quite human, but they're not yet gods either. They have one parent or something in their family tree that was a god or a goddess, and so they have these qualities that some entirely mortal beings don't have. And this seems to me the area of the superhero. They are these figures that aren't quite human. They have some supra-human capacity in some way, whether it's strength or speed or intellect or what have you. That is, it somehow transcends the kind of the normal human experience. And I think that's very appealing because I think it's often the case that being human is the last thing we want to be. And it's hard. It's hard to be a human. And
we have so many frailties.
Oh, yeah. When we were talking online, you had mentioned the MythBlast that I wrote most recently called She Was Yar, and I was looking at the archetype of love in the movie The Philadelphia Story.
Yeah.
Well, this is, I think, one of the central messages of that movie is you have to learn to develop some regard for human frailty. And that's when we're most human, is when we understand that we're vulnerable, that we understand that we're temporal beings, that we're not immortal. In fact, I think being immortal would really be unpleasant. I think this is why in the Greek gods, anyway, the pantheon is really, for the most part, unhappy. They're unsatisfied. They're finding, they mess around with human beings for the joy of it, the way, some little kids will use a magnifying glass on an anthill or something. And there's this sense that they're just bored and tired of their existence. And I think that's what would happen if you were immortal. I mean, you run out of first experiences eventually. And then, then it's just, what can I do to, create a diversion for myself?
Yeah. They kind of just go around behaving on whatever whims they have at the time. In a sense, it's almost as if, as humans, I often think about why do we think in stories? And one of the ideas that I have, I'm not saying that this is true, but one of the ideas I have is that something about our cognitive abilities allows us to recognize the passing of time, where we know that something happened to us before and we can remember it, and we're here now, but we also know that something's going to happen in the future. And part of all stories is that there's a beginning and an end. And as humans, we're born and in some way we all know that at some point we're going to die, whether we really want to dwell on it or not, or push it off to some afterlife that we can worry about then. But to be immortal means that you don't die. And so in a sense, it's as if you don't have a story, because there is no end. It just keeps going. And if it just keeps going, it's almost like an episode of The Simpsons or something, where they start off with one storyline and 5 minutes later you're on a completely different storyline that has no relation. It's just a bunch of nonsense. And I think you're right. I think it would be pretty brutal to just know that you're going to live forever. In a sense, it's like knowing that you don't get a conclusion. There's no end. There's no wrapping it up and putting a bow on it, which is, in a sense, it's very human to want to do that.
Yeah, you remind me. There was I think, 14th century Zen poet by the name of Yoshida Kinko, and he wrote this book. It had this marvelous. This is what drew me to it. Was the title of this book, uh, "Essays on Idleness," and it's this very kind of gentle, good-humored look at just the nature of being human. And at some point in the book, he says, if we were never to die, if we were never fade away, we would hardly be able to understand the beauty of things. And this is the thing that humans have that the gods may not have. Now, the gods have a sense of aesthetics. I think that's true. And depending on the god, whether or not the aesthetic is garish or not, is up to the individual to decide. But I'm not sure that they have a sense of beauty. I don't see the gods reading, for instance, great literature. There's not some, literary god, even though there's, my specialty is the Greeks, so that's kind of what I know best, and that's why I keep using that as a reference. They have the muses who are responsible for literature and music and all that sort of thing, poetry, but mostly inspired in human beings. And so they're like in this kind of hermetically sealed existence where they're not really touched by beauty. And beauty, I think, is the great palliative for being human. And I think that's what these myths point to, by the way, and literature. When you read really great literature, you're struck by the beauty of it. Whether it's a story that works out well for everybody, or whether it's William Faulkner, you're no matter what the outcome of the story is, what you walk away from is this sense of being touched by the beauty of it.
Yeah. I find beauty in simply in the words, sometimes in the way that things are described, because I'm fascinated sometimes. I'm awestruck sometimes by just how beautifully words can be put together, and then the images that they can create. Yeah, I often, I can't remember I can't remember if it came from a Joseph Campbell book, but it might have been in his Eastern mythology the portion of Mask of God in the Eastern section, where he talks about the Japanese people and how they got to a point in their Buddhist practice where they were worshiping beauty. And ever
Right.
since then, I've had this idea of, surround yourself with beauty, because beauty it's very human to come to see how things can be fleeting. They can go away. I was talking about this with my wife recently. We have 2 kids and we have this beautiful little family, and we were just realizing, like, we're halfway through it because they're going to move out. And even that thing that is so beautiful to us, it's temporary. Everything is temporary. Every relationship, every experience, every opportunity is temporary. And maybe that's why there's like an urgency to see the beauty in it and experience it when we can.
Yeah. But I think knowing that family life is going to come to an end someday, when they go out on their own and all that makes it even more beautiful for you, I suspect, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Especially imagining them going and kind of finding their own beauty in the world. That's, as a parent, that's probably the most rewarding, beautiful thing you can come across.
Yeah.
Or imagine. Yeah. Well, Brad, I really appreciate you having this conversation with me. We're over an hour now, so I want to give you back the rest of your afternoon. But
wow, that went fast. Okay.
It always does. Yeah. We'll have to do it again, because I really do want to there's a couple of ideas that I would love to dig deeper with you around the new myth. And
I would love to do that.
yeah, and I did read your article that your post that you wrote for the MythBlast back in February. My She Was Yar, and I had all these notes of things to talk about with that as well. And romance being to me one of those myths that we're living that people aren't always conscious that it's a myth. But yeah, I really
we seem to think that we find ourselves in the other, when in fact it's just the opposite. The relationship of love is a people growing machine, as a psychologist I know used to say.
Yeah, we love to literalize even romance, and really just like all the other myths, it's about something that's going on inside of us. And the other person, if you've got the right partner, they really can help you become more conscious and be a better version of yourself. But if you literalize it too much and you expect them to complete you in some way, for them to literally be your other half, I think that's the cycle that a lot of unhappy marriages get into. So yeah, well, I definitely would like to do it again. This was great. But before we close up, if people wanted to find you, they wanted to find your work, where would they go online? Your website or social media or anything?
You could certainly go to the Joseph Campbell Foundation. We've got a very searchable website there, and you could search for my name, and you would find, I think, all the MythBlasts I've ever written, and they probably number there's probably over 100 by now, but those will be there. The podcast, you can find a link to Pathways with Joseph Campbell there at the Campbell website, jcf.org. It's also available wherever you get your podcasts. All you have to do is search for Pathways with Joseph Campbell. You can go to my website, which is bradleyolsonphd.com, and I have a site there that's about what's mything in your life. And I think that's where you found me, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
I originally found you through the MythBlast newsletter.
Okay.
But then I did go to your website and peruse it there as well. Yeah.
So thank you so much. This was a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. Okay, bye.